Kel's breath came in ragged gasps, his pulse thundering as pain shot through his body with every movement. He could feel the wetness of his own blood pooling beneath him, staining the dirt of the battlefield. The alien energy weapon had torn through his side, leaving a jagged wound that sizzled with the residual heat of the blast. His vision blurred, the edges of the world growing dim as he tried to push himself to his feet. But he couldn't. His strength was gone, his muscles too battered, his senses slipping away into the blackness of unconsciousness. He thought of the mission. An easy hit, they'd told him. A small group of Taroth outlaws holed up in the jungle, far from their main forces. One clean strike, and he'd be back at the drop zone, sipping whiskey and counting his pay. Simple, but things had gone wrong. The Taroth had been waiting for him. An ambush. And now he was bleeding out in a wilderness that didn't care if he lived or died. Cal's mind spun, but through the haze, a sense of danger pushed him to focus. The Taroth were still out there, searching for survivors. He had to keep moving, had to find a way to hide. His hand clenched, grasping the hilt of the plasma pistol at his side, but it slipped from his grip before he could draw it. His last weapon had already been expended in the futile firefight. Just when he thought everything was lost, a rustle in the bushes caught his attention. He tensed, but instead of the expected Taroth warrior or coalition soldier, a shadow loomed over him, a figure, tall and strong, moving silently through the underbrush. In the next instant, the figure was kneeling beside him, and the blurred features of a woman came into focus. Her hands were gentle, yet precise, as they worked over him, pressing against his wounds with a cool, strange touch. "Stay still," she murmured, her voice soft but commanding. It was the kind of voice that didn't ask questions, that didn't seek approval. It simply gave instructions. Cale blinked, his mind reeling. The human. How had she found him? Who is she? Her face was partially hidden beneath a scarf, her eyes intense and focused as she worked. She didn't seem to care that she was aiding a mercenary, a known killer. Her hands glowed with an unfamiliar, faint light as she touched the wound, and to his astonishment, the burning pain seemed to dull. "What are you doing?" Cale managed to rasp, struggling to keep his eyes open. The woman didn't answer immediately, continuing her work as if the question was irrelevant. She applied a strange salve to his wound, something viscous and glimmering, before wrapping it with strips of cloth. The pain lessened, but a deeper weariness settled in. She wasn't just treating the wound. She was pulling something from him, some ancient energy that made Cale feel as if his very life force was being drained. She looked up, her gaze locking onto his with quiet intensity. "I'm saving you," she said simply, the words carrying a weight that made him wonder if it was more than just a physical healing. "But you'll owe me." Cale wanted to argue, to ask more questions, but the darkness was closing in. His body had fought too hard, and now it craved rest. As the world slipped away, one thought lingered in his mind. Who is she? And what does she want with me? Cale awoke to a world of quiet shadows. His body felt lighter, but not in the way it should have. There was something unsettling about how he moved. The pain from his injury had dulled, but the sensation of being watched persisted. His eyes slowly adjusted to the dim light filtering through the canopy of trees above. He was lying on a simple cot, the smell of damp earth and herbs thick in the air. His wound, once a gaping, fiery hole, was now a faint scar, almost healed. The woman from before was there, sitting at a small fire in the corner, her eyes studying him. She was humming a low tune, something that felt ancient and foreign to him. The sight of her stirred a strange discomfort in his chest. He had no memory of being brought here, only fragments. She hadn't been just a healer. There was something more to her. Cale had seen enough to know when someone was hiding something. "You're awake," she said, her tone soft, but not entirely warm. "I thought you'd sleep for a day more." Cale didn't reply immediately. His gaze darted around the small camp, strange symbols carved into the bark of nearby trees, the remnants of old technology hidden among the underbrush, things that didn't belong in this wilderness. "Where am I?" he finally rasped, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe for now," she answered simply. Her hands were still busy, working over herbs, preparing something he couldn't quite understand. Cale sat up, the familiar urge to run taking root in his chest. The wilderness outside the camp felt too quiet, too still. His fingers flexed, searching for a weapon that wasn't there. He'd been vulnerable before. He wouldn't make that mistake again. "Who are you?" he asked, voice low, but insistent. "Why help me?" She paused in her work, then turned to face him fully. Her eyes locked onto his, and there was a coldness there, a certainty that unsettled him more than the silence of the forest. "My name is Ayla, and you've been chosen." Cale's brow furrowed. Chosen for what? A death sentence. Ayla shook her head, the faintest smile touching her lips. "No, for something bigger." A chill ran down his spine as he heard the weight of her words. His mind was still foggy from the recovery, but there was an intensity to her presence that he couldn't ignore. "What's bigger than this? I'm a mercenary, not some savior." Ayla didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood up, walking toward him with purpose. "Your wound wasn't just a wound, Cale. It was a signal. Something inside you was calling out. You've been part of something for far longer than you know." Cale's stomach twisted. A signal. His head was spinning, trying to piece together what she meant. "What do you mean?" "I've been nothing but a hired killer, nothing special." Ayla's gaze softened, but there was still that knowing glint in her eyes, as if she saw something in him he couldn't see himself. "I can't explain it all right now, but what I can tell you is this. There's a power inside you, one you've never known. And now that you've healed, you're awakening." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. He was no fool. He had fought enough battles, seen enough strange things, to know when something supernatural was in play. But a power inside him, he felt normal. He looked down at his body, no different than it had been before the ambush. Yet the scar on his side tingled as if it were alive. "I'm not interested in whatever mystical power you think I have," Cale growled. "I just want to get out of here and finish my mission." Ayla's expression darkened, the hum of the forest seeming to deepen in tone. "You're not going anywhere," she said, her voice suddenly sharp. "Not until you understand what's at stake. The Taroth are coming for you, and they'll destroy everything in their path to get to you." The word struck him like a blow. The Taroth. He had been hunting them for years, fighting them wherever they appeared. They had no mercy, no honor. And now, it seemed, they had set their sights on him. Ayla's gaze softened again, but it was clear that something was changing. Cale was no longer just a soldier in a war. He was a piece in something far bigger, something terrifying. "You may have been a mercenary, Cale, but you're part of a much larger story now." She paused, her voice almost a whisper. "And you have a choice to make. But first, you need to survive." Cale's mind raced. Ayla's words felt like a heavy fog settling over him, each one more suffocating than the last. The larger story. He had never asked for any of this. All he wanted was to be left alone, to heal and move on. But now, with the Taroth hunting him, that option was slipping further away with each passing moment. The air around the camp seemed to grow still, too still. A faint rustling in the distance made Cale's instincts flare. He stood up abruptly, his body betraying him with a wave of dizziness. The wound had healed, but the weakness in his muscles still lingered, making every movement feel like it came with a price. "You can't stay here," Ayla said, rising to her feet as well. She didn't seem surprised by his sudden urgency. "The Taroth won't stop until they have you." Cale grabbed his plasma pistol, the weapon now feeling heavier than it ever had before. Ayla's cryptic warnings had settled in his gut like stones, but he couldn't shake the feeling that staying here was a death sentence. He didn't know what was so special about him, what made him a target, But he'd seen enough destruction at the hands of the Turath to know that if they wanted him, they'd burn everything in their path to get him. "You're right," he muttered, his voice tight. "We need to leave." Before Ayla could respond, the ground trembled beneath their feet, followed by a low, grinding roar that vibrated through the trees. Cal's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to be told who it was. The Troth had arrived. Without warning, a group of heavily armored Troth soldiers stormed into the clearing, their alien weapons drawn and their eyes scanning the area. Their crimson armor gleamed in the low light, and the monstrous helmets they wore made them appear even more menacing. Cal instinctively dropped to a crouch, his breath shallow as he surveyed the situation. Ayla was already moving, her hand raised, the strange energy that pulsed around her glowing more brightly. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, even as the Turath closed in on their position. "You have to trust me," she said, her voice steady despite the imminent threat. "This is the only way." Cal wasn't sure what she meant, but he didn't have time to question it. The Turath saw them. A voice like a guttural growl shouted in their language, and the soldiers charged forward with deadly precision. In a blur of motion, Cal's reflexes kicked in. He fired his plasma pistol, the energy bolt striking the first Turoth soldier square in the chest. The alien staggered back, but didn't fall. The Turoth were tougher than any enemy he had ever faced. Cal swore under his breath and ducked behind a nearby tree, taking cover from the barrage of fire. Ayla, however, was unbothered by the chaos. She stepped forward into the open, her hands weaving through the air as though she were conducting an unseen orchestra. A shimmering, translucent shield flickered to life around her, deflecting the Turath's energy blasts as if they were nothing more than raindrops. Cal's eyes widened in disbelief. He had never seen anything like this before. The Turath's weaponry was some of the most advanced in the galaxy, but Ayla was stopping it with ease. "They're not just after you," Ayla called over the noise, her voice calm as ever. "They want what's inside you. And if they get it, they'll use it to wipe out every human colony." Cal's mind struggled to catch up as he fired again, dooming another soldier. His pulse quickened, the realization dawning on him. What's inside me? He had no answers, but he knew one thing. The Turath would stop at nothing to get him, and he had to survive long enough to figure out why. The forest around them erupted into chaos. The Turath soldiers were relentless, and Cal was quickly running out of options. But Ella's shield was holding, her power was incredible, but it wouldn't last forever. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of their desperation hanging heavy between them. Then, just as Cal began to think they might not make it out alive, a roar echoed through the trees, a massive explosion that sent shockwaves through the clearing. Cal spun, his heart leaping into his throat. Emerging from the smoke and debris was something larger than any of the Turoth soldiers, a towering insectoid war machine, a Turoth warlord, its sharp, segmented limbs clanking as it moved with terrifying speed. It had a jagged, twisted face and towering wings that sent gusts of wind whipping through the trees. It didn't stop. It was coming for them. Cal's grip tightened on his pistol. Ella's shield flickered, barely holding under the pressure. They weren't going to survive this fight, unless they did something drastic, something dangerous. "Now," Ayla shouted, her voice raw with urgency. "We have to move." The ground shook beneath Cal's boots as the Turoth warlord charged forward, its enormous frame pushing through the trees with a terrifying ease. Cal's heart hammered in his chest, every instinct telling him to run, to retreat. But there was no time. The clearing was surrounded, and Ella's shimmering shield was weakening under the relentless assault. They couldn't keep holding out here. Ayla's eyes met his for a brief, fleeting moment, calm, but filled with an unspoken understanding. "We need to fight," she said, her voice unwavering. "It's the only way." Cal didn't hesitate. He had no choice. His survival instinct had kicked in, and he surged forward, adrenaline sharpening his senses. His pistol blazed, each shot landing with deadly accuracy, but the warlord kept advancing, impervious to the damage. The Taroth war machine had a thick exoskeleton, tough enough to shrug off anything Kel could throw at it. Ayla, her hands outstretched, focused her energy, and the shield flared brightly again. But this time, she was not just defending. The air around her shimmered with a new intensity, and in a sudden burst, a wave of force shot outward. The Taroth warlord reeled back, thrown off balance for a moment, but it quickly regained its footing. "Cover me," Ayla shouted, and Kale didn't waste a second. He sprinted towards the warlord, diving for a thick, fallen tree trunk to take cover behind. His mind raced with strategies, but the only thing that seemed certain was that brute force wouldn't cut it. He needed to outsmart the creature. He remembered the flash of a glowing weak point on the warlord's underbelly when Ayla's blast had pushed it back. If he could get underneath it, he might have a chance. He reloaded quickly, took a breath, and dashed toward the warlord, weaving between the trees to stay out of its line of sight. The warlord, growling in frustration, turned its many eyes toward him, its limbs twitching as it prepared for another charge. Cal's pulse raced as he sprinted forward, adrenaline coursing through him. The warlord's massive body loomed ahead, and he dove at the last moment, rolling beneath its belly. He could hear the beast's sharp exoskeleton scraping against the earth, its limbs snapping at the air, but Kale was fast. His fingers closed around a jagged piece of scrap metal, sharp and heavy. Without hesitation, he rammed it into the exposed, glowing weak spot beneath the warlord's armored hide. The creature screeched, a sound so high-pitched and guttural it rattled his bones, and staggered back, stumbling away from the strike. Kale didn't wait to see if the blow had finished the job. He was already back on his feet, running for Ayla. She was still holding the shield, but the strain was showing. Her body was trembling, sweat slicking her brow. She was not invincible, and Kel could see the toll it was taking on her. Her power was draining fast. "Get us out of here," Kale shouted, pulling her arm and leading her through the chaos. Ayla's eyes locked onto his. There was a spark of something deeper there, something Kale didn't understand but could feel in his gut. "I can't just run," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm not leaving until we finish this." Just as she spoke, the ground beneath them shook violently, and a pulse of energy from the warlord sent a shockwave through the air, knocking them both to the ground. Cal's vision blurred, the world spinning, but he didn't lose consciousness. Struggling to his knees, Cal saw the Taroth warlord standing above them, its many eyes glaring down, and he realized. This was at asterisk. They were out of options. Just as he prepared to fight to the last, a sound broke through the chaos. Engines. Heavy, mechanical engines. Kale turned his head and saw a coalition dropship descending through the smoke-filled sky, its hull gleaming under the dim sunlight. A sleek black figure, wearing the emblem of the King's Guard, stood at the doorway, weapons ready. Cal's heart sank as recognition hit him like a hammer. The coalition. He had hoped to escape them, but it seemed they had tracked him down too. Ayla, still crouched beside him, cursed under her breath. They're too late. But Cal wasn't so sure. If the coalition was here, they had a choice to make, fight, or make a deal. "I'll take care of the warlord," Cal muttered, his voice steady despite the tension building inside him. "You deal with them." Ayla hesitated, her gaze flicking from him to the descending dropship, and then back to the warlord. "Don't get yourself killed, mercenary." Cal only smiled grimly. "I'm good at surviving." With that, he charged forward, plasma pistol in hand, towards the warlord that had nearly taken his life. The coalition may have been their salvation, or their damnation, but one thing was certain. This fight was far from over. Kel's heart pounded in his chest as he closed the distance between himself and the Taroth warlord. Every step felt like it could be his last, but the adrenaline surged through his veins, driving him forward. The warlord was recovering from the strike to its weak point, its eyes flashing with murderous intent as it righted itself, its insectoid limbs clacking on the ground like a death sentence. It was going to charge again. Cal's fingers tightened around the grip of his plasma pistol, the weapon a comforting weight in his hand. The plasma had barely scratched the beast's tough armor before, but there was no time to rethink his options. He needed to keep it distracted long enough for Ayla to do whatever she was planning with the Coalition forces. But Ayla was still recovering from the strain of her shield. She wasn't going to last much longer, and Cal knew it. She was their key to surviving this. The Taroth wouldn't stop until they got what they wanted, and Cal had learned over the years that no one could stop the Taroth once they set their sights on a target. But if Ayla could somehow give them a chance, if she could summon enough power to drive the warlord back long enough for the Coalition to do something. Ayla was already on her feet, her eyes narrowing as she focused on the warlord. Her hands moved in precise gestures, and the air around her hummed with energy. She wasn't finished yet. "Get ready," she yelled to Cal, her voice strained, but filled with resolve. Cal didn't need any more encouragement. He sprinted toward the warlord, firing at its legs, hoping to slow it down. The plasma bolts landed, but the warlord didn't even flinch. The creature's attention was fully on him now, its massive mandibles clicking in anger. It swiped one of its huge claws at Cal, sending him tumbling to the side just in time. His body slammed into a boulder, the impact jarring his ribs, but he fought through the pain and sprang back to his feet. A moment later, the burst of energy filled the air, and Cal looked up to see Ayla raising both hands toward the sky. A blue-white beam of light shot out from her, slamming into the warlord with an intensity that made Cal's breath catch. The warlord screeched in agony, its limbs twitching as the energy burned into its exoskeleton. The creature staggered back, disoriented. That was Cal's chance. He darted forward, his pistol raised, and aimed for the weak spot beneath the warlord's armor, where he had struck earlier. But as he did, a loud whine filled the air, followed by the roar of Coalition engines. The dropship came into full view, its weapons locked onto the warlord. A powerful laser blast tore through the sky, striking the warlord directly in the chest. Cal shielded his eyes from the explosion, the shockwave knocking him off balance, but when he looked up, the warlord was no longer standing. Its massive body crumpled to the ground, twitching and steaming, a smoldering ruin of armor and twisted metal. The Coalition had arrived just in time, but Cal couldn't afford to relax. There was still the matter of the soldiers descending from the dropship. He turned to Ayla, who had collapsed to her knees, her face pale and drenched in sweat. She had pushed herself too hard, and Cal knew she wouldn't be able to hold up much longer. A group of heavily armored Coalition soldiers emerged from the dropship, their weapons trained on Cal and Ayla. The tension in the air was palpable, and Cal's hand instinctively reached for his sidearm, though he knew it was futile. They had the drop on him, and Ayla's weakened state only made their position worse. A tall, imposing officer stepped forward, his dark eyes scanning the scene with cold calculation. The insignia on his chest marked him as a member of the King's elite guard. His voice was smooth, authoritative. "Cal Rook, Mercenary. I'm sure you've heard of us." Cal didn't answer immediately. The King's Guard, elite, untouchable, and ruthless. He had no love for them. He had seen their handiwork during countless campaigns and skirmishes, and he knew they had no hesitation in getting what they wanted. The officer's gaze lingered on Ayla for a moment before returning to Cal. "We've been tracking you, Rook. You're a wanted man, but it seems our interests align." For the moment, the officer continued, "We need her, and we need you alive. For now, I suggest you don't make this any harder." Ayla's breathing was shallow, but she was still conscious. She met Cal's gaze, her eyes dark with a mixture of pain and frustration. The Coalition had found them, and while they might have saved their lives, it wasn't out of kindness. They had their own reasons. "I don't work for anyone," Cal growled, his voice rough with the strain of the fight, "and I'm not interested in whatever you think you can offer." The officer's lips twitched into a smile, but it was more of a sneer than anything else. Perhaps you'll reconsider. The king has plans for you, mercenary. You might find your services more valuable than you think. Kel's fingers twitched toward his sidearm, but he knew the danger. The coalition was too powerful, and Ella's condition made their escape almost impossible. For now, he had no choice but to play along. "Let's just say I'm open to negotiation," Kel said, his voice low, masking the tension in his chest. But as the officer's men began to move in, Kel realized something else. Whatever the coalition had planned for him, it was going to change everything. The mission, his life, everything was about to spiral into a new dangerous game. And in this game, he had no idea what the rules were. Kel kept his hand near his sidearm, ready for any movement that might signal an attack, but he knew the odds. The coalition soldiers were too well trained, and they were closing in quickly. Even if he managed to get off a shot, it would be the last thing he ever did. They were playing a game he didn't understand, one with rules that kept shifting under his feet. The officer, unfazed by Kel's defiance, stepped closer, his eyes locking onto Ayla, still on her knees, struggling to regain her strength. His expression softened, but only momentarily. "You're lucky we found you when we did," the officer said, his voice suddenly laced with a chilling politeness. "The Turoth don't take kindly to their prey escaping, and you," he glanced at Ayla, "might have just turned the tide for us. We have much to discuss." Ayla managed a weak, defiant glare, but the exhaustion was written all over her face. She was barely holding on, and Kel could see that her powers had drained her more than she was letting on. If she passed out now, they were both dead. The officer motioned to one of his soldiers, who stepped forward with a medkit. "You're both coming with us," he said, ignoring the tension between them. "We can help her, but only if you cooperate." Kel's gaze flicked from Ayla to the officer. The last thing he wanted was to be at the mercy of the coalition. The King's Guard was not known for their compassion, and Kel knew the kind of help they were offering. If they wanted Ayla alive, they'd keep her under their thumb, using her until she was no longer useful. "What do you want with us?" Kel growled, his voice low but steady. The officer's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "What we want is simple. You're a mercenary, Kel. You've made a name for yourself. The king needs soldiers, strong ones who aren't afraid to get their hands dirty. And then there's your associate." He gestured at Ayla, who was now being carefully tended to by the soldier with the medkit. "Her power, whatever it is, it's valuable. We can use it. And you're the perfect asset to keep her in line." Kel's mind raced. The officer was right about one thing. The coalition knew how to play the long game. They weren't just after him. They were after Ayla, and by extension, they were using Kel as a pawn to control her. The price of cooperation was clear. He would be forced to fight for their cause, to serve a king who cared little for the lives of those beneath him. "You're wrong," Kel said, his voice growing colder, more certain. "You think you can control us, but you have no idea what you're dealing with." The officer didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. "We don't need to control you, Kel. We just need your compliance. And I think you'll find that you're better off working with us than against us." Kel's gaze hardened. The officer might have underestimated him, but Kel wasn't foolish. His mind worked fast, calculating every possible escape, every potential advantage. If the coalition thought they had him cornered, they were in for a surprise. Ella's condition was worsening. She needed medical attention, and fast. Kel knew that if they didn't act quickly, she would be too weak to help them in the future. But the more he thought about it, the more the situation felt like a no-win. They were trapped between two forces, the coalition, who would use them like tools, and the Turoth, who would destroy them without a second thought. The officer's smirk faltered for a moment, noticing Kel's contemplative silence. "It doesn't have to be hard, mercenary. You've fought worse battles than this." Kale didn't respond immediately. He couldn't afford to show his hand just yet. Instead, he looked toward the dropship, noting the soldiers standing guard around it. Escape was impossible with so many soldiers on watch, and even if they made a run for it, Ayla couldn't keep up. She was too weak, and Kale wasn't going to abandon her. But there was one thing the officer didn't know. Kale had always thrived when the odds were stacked against him. He didn't need to fight with brute strength or raw firepower. He needed to outsmart them. "Fine," Kale finally said, his voice steady, almost cordial. "We'll come with you. But make no mistake. I don't trust you, and I won't play by your rules." The officer raised an eyebrow, surprised by Kale's sudden shift in demeanor. He clearly didn't expect compliance so easily. "I'm glad we're on the same page, Mercenary. Your cooperation will go a long way." Kale didn't respond. He didn't need to. His mind was already working on a plan, one that didn't involve working for the King's Guard. He would play along for now. He would let them think they had control. But the moment the opportunity arose, Kale would take it. The Coalition's grip on him and Ayla wouldn't last forever. The officer turned, signaling to his men to lower their weapons and start leading them toward the dropship. Kale's eyes never left the officer's back, his hand still near his weapon, his thoughts swirling with 1,000 possibilities. He might not know exactly what the Coalition had planned for them, but one thing was clear. He would make sure it didn't end with him in their service. Not if he had anything to say about it. Kale's mind churned as he followed the Coalition soldiers toward the dropship, Ayla stumbling beside him. The officer had been too confident, too sure that they would simply fall into line. Kale knew better. He had seen too many would-be kings and power-hungry generals underestimate those they thought they could control. The moment he and Ayla were alone, or when the opportunity presented itself, he would make his move. But for now, they were playing the Coalition's game, and Kale hated it. As they approached the ship, the large metallic doors of the dropship slid open with a hiss, revealing the cold, clinical interior. Stark white walls, reinforced with metal, were illuminated by stereo lights overhead. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find in the midst of a war zone, but it was exactly the kind of place the Coalition's elite would thrive in. Everything in this ship screamed power, control, and precision. Nothing was left to chance. Ayla winced as one of the soldiers helped her inside, her breathing shallow. Kale caught the faint glint of pain in her eyes. She wasn't just physically exhausted. There was something else going on, something she wasn't telling him. They were guided into a narrow corridor, and Kale took a moment to scan his surroundings. It wasn't exactly a high-security area, but it was clear that the Coalition didn't want to take any chances with them. Armed guards stood at regular intervals, their weapons slung but ready. A few doors on either side of the corridor were locked tight, their purpose hidden behind steel and secrecy. The officer who had greeted them earlier led the way, a constant, mocking smile on his face. He must have enjoyed this moment, bringing them in, showcasing his dominance, watching Kale and Ayla fall into his control. "I'm sure you have questions," the officer said, his voice smooth, almost too smooth, "and you'll get your answers. But first, we have some preparations to make. The king has been eager to meet you." Kale narrowed his eyes. The king. The one person who held all the strings, who pulled all the levers of power in this war. He had no doubt that the Coalition's interest in them wasn't merely tactical. It was something bigger. Ayla's strange abilities were a key part of whatever plans the king had in mind. And Kale. He was a tool, just as much a piece of the puzzle as she was. They came to a door at the end of the corridor, where the officer stopped and turned to face them. His smile faded, replaced with the cold professionalism of a man who knew he was about to have his moment of triumph. "Inside," he ordered. The door slid open, and Kale was greeted by an imposing figure sitting at a sleek black desk. The man was older than Kale had imagined, with short, graying hair and sharp features that seemed to be carved from stone. He wore a uniform that was both regal and practical, an emblem of the King's Guard embossed on the chest, a display of authority and dominance. But it wasn't the man's appearance that commanded attention. It was the air around him. There was a presence to him, something that made the room feel smaller, colder, more suffocating. "Ah, Cal Rook." The King's voice was smooth, but there was no warmth in it. "I've heard much about you." Cale held his ground, refusing to show any weakness. He wasn't here to cower before anyone. "I'm sure you've heard the stories. What's your point?" The King's lips curled into a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You are a mercenary, Cale. A soldier of fortune. A man who works for whoever can pay. But I think you and I both know that there are bigger forces at play now. Your little skirmishes with the Turath. They were a distraction. The real war is coming, and I need you. Both of you." Cale clenched his jaw, but didn't say a word. He wasn't sure if he hated the King for his arrogance or his cold, calculated manner, but he knew one thing for sure. The Coalition was playing a dangerous game, and he was stuck in the middle of it. The King's gaze flicked to Ayla, who was standing slightly behind Cale, still swaying slightly as if she could fall at any moment. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes glinted with a fierce, unspoken defiance. "Ayla," the King said, his tone softer now, as though he were speaking to someone far more important than a mere ally. "Your abilities are intriguing, powerful. You'll make an excellent asset to the Coalition." Cale felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he kept it in check. He had no idea what the King was planning, but it didn't sound good. And it certainly didn't sound like a life of freedom for Ayla. "Is that why you brought us here?" Cale demanded, stepping forward. "To use her? To make her a weapon for your King's ambitions?" The King didn't flinch, his cold eyes never leaving Cale. "I don't have time for games, mercenary. Your skills are needed. If you refuse, well, we both know how expendable you are. But if you cooperate, you'll see that I offer you something far more valuable than anything you've ever been offered before." Cale felt the weight of those words press on his chest. The King wasn't just talking about money. He was talking about power. Cale's fingers twitched at his side. He wasn't sure how much longer he could pretend to play along. But as the King's cold gaze held him, Cale knew one thing for sure. Nothing was as it seemed, and he was about to uncover just how deep this deception ran. The King's gaze never wavered as Cale stood his ground, the weight of his words sinking in. The room felt smaller now, suffocating, and Cale could sense that this was the moment where everything they had fought for, everything they had survived, would either shatter or take a new, darker turn. Ayla, still leaning on him for support, barely seemed to register the King's words. Her exhaustion was almost palpable, but Cale knew that inside, she was as sharp as ever. She had to be. For both their sakes. The King continued, his voice low and methodical, each syllable dripping with calculated power. "You've heard the stories of the Turath. What you don't know is that they're just the beginning. I've been tracking them for years, gathering data, anticipating their moves. But they are not the only threat. There are others out there, darker, more insidious, and they have their sights set on this galaxy." Cale clenched his fists, his heart racing. The King's words sounded almost too familiar, like a warning that should have been given long ago. And yet this was the first time Cale was hearing them. The true stakes of this war were much higher than he could have imagined. The Turath were only the tip of the iceberg. "You need both of us," Cale said, his voice hard. "But not because you want our help. You need us because we're useful. So what's your endgame? What do you really want from us?" The King leaned back in his chair, a slight smirk playing at the corners of his lips. "It's not just about you and Ayla, mercenary. It's about the future. The King has plans that will reshape the galaxy. You'll be part of that future, whether you choose to accept it or not. But your choices, however, will have consequences. For you, for her, and for everyone else." A shiver ran down Cal's spine as the king's words hung heavy in the air. This wasn't just about fighting in a war. It was about reshaping the entire galaxy, remaking it into something the king could control. Ayla's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "You're not going to use me," she said, her voice weak but resolute. "I'm not a tool for your war. You can't bend me to your will." The king's eyes narrowed, a flicker of annoyance flashing across his features. "Don't mistake me for someone who doesn't understand power, girl," he said, his tone icy. "I didn't come here to play games. You will help us, whether you like it or not. And you, Mercenary," he turned his gaze back to Kale, "you will keep her in line." Cal's pulse quickened. He wasn't sure how much longer he could hold onto his temper. Every word from the king felt like a jab at his sense of agency, his autonomy, his freedom. Ayla was right. This wasn't just a matter of surviving anymore. They were pawns in someone else's game, a game that could only end one way, with the king victorious. But Kale wasn't about to let that happen. Not if he could help it. "I think we both know how this ends," Kale said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "You want control. You want power. But the moment you think you can break us, you'll realize you've made the wrong choice." The king stood up slowly, his eyes locking onto Cal's with a dangerous intensity. "You're underestimating me, Mercenary. That's your first mistake. Your second mistake will be when you find out just how much control I have over you both." Ayla, still leaning heavily on Cal, finally spoke again. Her voice was quiet, but the resolve in it was unmistakable. "You don't control me." Cal felt a rush of pride at her words. She wasn't broken. She would never be broken. And that made them dangerous. The king's expression shifted from amusement to something colder, sharper. "We'll see about that." With a quick gesture, the officer who had led them into the room stepped forward, his posture rigid, his weapon poised. "Escort them to the containment cells. They'll stay there until the king has further use for them." The word containment hit Cal like a slap in the face. A cell. A cage. It was exactly what he had feared. This wasn't just about making them useful. It was about locking them up until the king needed them for his grand designs. As Cal and Ayla were escorted from the room, the weight of their situation pressed down on them. But Cal wasn't about to let this defeat them. They might be in the king's grasp now, but Cal had always found a way out of tight spots before, and with Ayla by his side, they would find a way out of this one too. In the cold, sterile corridors of the coalition ship, Cal's mind worked furiously. The king might have the upper hand for now, but Cal was never one to follow orders without finding a way to turn the tables. The game had only just begun.